Okay, thank you so much, everyone. There's such great experience and lots of different places for us to think about. So I'm just going to launch in here, and maybe Brandon, you can move us to the first slide. And I'm just going to try to give you a brief overview of what Watershed Discipleship is. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that I am not an expert in this field. This is something that I'm coming to and learning about as a way of living out my own Christian life and vocation as, you know, a person created by God and so on. So I want to acknowledge my teachers in this, two of them anyway, which is Ched Myers, who edited a book called Watershed Discipleship and has done a huge amount of work on this. And there's a Watershed Discipleship website where there are tons of resources. Ched is a prolific writer. He wrote a very famous book called Binding the Strong Man, which is a political reading of the Gospel of Mark, among other things. So Ched Myers. And the other one is Laurel Dykstra, who leads a community in Vancouver called Salal and Cedar, and they worship outside. She has been really inspirational to encourage connecting more deeply with creation, not just as a pretty place, but as a place where we live out our vocation. And she also gave a sort of a TED-like talk, a thing called Anglicans Talking to One Another or something like that. But anyway, I really encourage you to watch that video because she'll give you a great overview, and much of what I'm going to say today, you're going to hear her say as well in her own context. So if we could go to the next slide. And let me just say that Watershed Discipleship obviously begins with this concept of a watershed. And it's very much grounded in the biblical story. This isn't a stretch. It's right there in the pages of the Bible. So obviously we live in God's good creation. God creates and God gives humankind dominion in a creation with limits, right? We can't transgress those limits. You can eat the food from these trees, but you can't eat the food from that tree. And we are given dominion, which has been misinterpreted to be put it in the broadest possible way as domination, kind of permission to destroy and to take whatever we want out of creation. And of course, this has gotten us into a huge mess. Dominion means more something like serve and observe creation, use skilled mastery in creation, or at its very basic, and I love this from Ellen Davis, it means to secure the food supply for all living creatures on the earth. That's what our responsibility is in creation. It's our primal vocation, if you will. And the fall, humanity's sin, if you will, is that we didn't take on that responsibility. And as the result of that was that the ground was cursed because there was no one caring for the ground, no one ensuring the flourishing of creation, because we as the caretakers of creation abandoned our vocation, literally. So the story in Genesis puts the Garden of Eden in a watershed. If you read the second chapter, you'll see there's 4 rivers. The 2 main rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates. And this is an amazing watershed, of course. It was Mesopotamia in the ancient world. It's a place where there are these abundant rivers, a very diverse watershed in terms of, because it flows from headwaters in mountains down to a more arid region. And this watershed was also a place where there were extensive wetlands and marshes, which have been destroyed in the last few decades due to war and to excessive drainage during the Saddam Hussein. So here we have this watershed that we have described in our sacred story that we now know has been decimated in recent years. So if you keep going through the biblical story, Noah experiences a climate catastrophe, and God, as the people emerge out of that catastrophe, makes a new beginning with humans in a covenant relationship, not only with humans, but with all creatures. God covenants with all creatures. So right away, our understanding of who we are in covenant relationship with is not just God, but all creatures. And God continues to lament the violence that humans continue to do to the earth. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River, conducts his ministry in the Jordan River watershed. So it's very specific and local kind of ministry. He talks about consider the lilies, consider the ravens. He's talking about the creatures and the plants, the floral and faunal community right where he lives. This is where we find Jesus rooting our vocational call to serve creation within our local context and as a counter, creating an alternative to the culture of empire and everything that comes along with that. And then when we get to the end of the biblical story, these are very broad strokes, but we come to the new creation, the renewed creation, where the earth restored and renewed is God's dwelling place. The river of life flows, the leaves of the trees of life are for the healing of the nations. So we have this image of a city that is abundant and flourishing. So that's just the broad strokes, but Chedmeyer says from Noah to New Jerusalem, our tradition is about the redemption of the earth, the terrestrial place where we live. So that's just where we see it in the biblical story. Brandon, can you bring up the next slide? So watershed discipleship. What is watershed discipleship within this biblical context? So the watershed discipleship movement recognizes that we're in a watershed moment in the life of the world. This is it. COP26 obviously is beginning today. There have been which means there have been 26 UN climate conferences. And some people are saying 27 will be too late. We have to get this right now. So this is a critical moment. It's a watershed moment in the life of the world in terms of environment, climate justice, and the significant change that we've brought to the world. And if we're going to have a livable planet at all, we got to do it now. When I first heard Laurel Dykstra talking about watershed discipleship, she named impoverished Indigenous and coastal communities as those most at risk in climate, with climate change. I think after the summer that we've just had, where we've seen Lytton, the town of Lytton burn, we've seen people dying in their Montreal apartments and so on, we're feeling the deepening effects of climate change. So this is a watershed moment. But that's an overwhelming crisis. It's an overwhelming thing. How do we save the planet? And watershed discipleship says we save the planet, we respond to this crisis in our place. So it means being disciples, watershed disciples, in the place where God has planted us. Location is vocation, if you will, as a friend said to me recently. So being a follower of Jesus, a follower of the way, in the here and now. One of the terms that people use in the watershed discipleship movement is replacement, that we have to kind of replace ourselves, connect to the place where we live and serve. So what's happening with the land and the water in your place? I was really happy to hear so many of you name those things. This is what I see happening, and I'm really concerned about that. And that's the first step, I think, in watershed discipleship, is noticing and wanting to respond. The question for us as watershed disciples is, what does it mean to follow the way in this place where we live? How do we love God and love our neighbors, considering that not only our human neighbors are in trouble here, but the creatures and the goldenrod and all of those things that we see, the bass nests that are no longer appearing. How do we care for those neighbors as well? God is revealed in creation always, and creation is always responding to God. So we're mindful of that that relationship. So the first thing we have to do is to listen. Wendell Berry says the question that must be addressed is not how to care for the planet, but how to care for each of the planet's millions of human and natural neighborhoods, each of its millions of small pieces and parcels of land, each of which is in some precious way different from all the others. So that's our task as watershed discipleships. We need to know our place. And that's a huge challenge. Laurel Dykstra, in her talk, she says, children will be able to name 100 corporate logos for you, but can they name 10 plants in their neighborhood? Do we know what species the cedars are in the places where we live? Do we know what the main water courses are? Do we know where the water goes in our area? Somebody mentioned, I think we're in the last lake of the watershed because the water doesn't go anywhere from here, so it's flowing down. So that's a really good observation. How did we come to live in this place? I grew up in the Otonabee watershed. In the back, with the sub-watershed is the Baxter Creek in a small village called Millbrook. My ancestors settled in that region in 1826, 200 years ago. And I always thought, wow, we have deep roots in this place. This is amazing. This is my place of belonging. Until I met my friend James Wheaton, who lives not far away on Curve Lake First Nation. And he harvests wild rice, manoman, the sacred grain in the lakes of that region. And he said to me, my people have been doing this work here for 10,000 years. 10,000 years. So that knowing your place, knowing who has been caretaking this land is really, really important as well. So can we go on to the next slide here? So our task as watershed disciples, this is kind of the mantra of the watershed disciple movement. We won't save the places we don't love. We can't love places we don't know, and we don't know places we haven't learned. And I think the heart of watershed discipleship is not only that we come to know our place by kind of gathering information, but that we dwell in our place and we let it teach us what it wants us to know. That in a very real way, watershed discipleship is being disciples not only in, but of the place where we live. Learning from our watershed what it needs and how we can be advocates for our watershed. The next part of our presentation that Brandon's going to take us through is about saving the love. Okay, there we go. As I said, I live in the Duffins Creek watershed now, and I've done some exploring in the region. I loved learning about this place, which is on Lake Ontario. But I became alarmed just about 500 yards from my bedroom window. A casino began to be built just down the road from me on land where I had noticed migrating birds would come and gather. And then all of a sudden this casino complex was being built. And I learned that roads were going to be rerouted and vast 5,000 parking spots was going to be made on this place where migratory birds. And so I started to get very concerned. And at my church at St. George's, I talked to other people. They were similarly concerned and lamenting these changes that they were seeing. And so we formed a creation caretakers group at the church. And we eventually joined forces with people from St. Martin's in Pickering. And the first thing we did was we went out and we prayed on the land. You're going to see a slide of that. We celebrated a Eucharist in early Advent on the land. And we also marched and just up and down the street that day, just to kind of let the community know, the people driving past, that we were really concerned. And then we got involved with ENAP, this citizen advocacy group, and people began to attend protests and distribute lawn signs and make phone calls and so on. And that's where I met Brandon. So Brandon, take it away with your presentation.
All righty.
Yeah.
So one part here too we have is just kind of what is your watershed. So if you're wondering about your watershed, we can provide you a resource link so you know what watershed you are in. So I can provide that in the chat maybe later on when we have some opportunity for questions and such. So if you are curious about that, we can definitely do that. Did you have something to add there, Susan?
Sure. So this is actually a map of our diocese, the Diocese of Toronto. And within this diocese, there are many watersheds, obviously. And we'll show you how you can locate within the Diocese of Toronto what your watershed is. But, watershed is an area of land that catches rain and snow and drains and seeps into a marsh, stream, river, lake, or groundwater. Homes, farms, cottages, forests, small towns, big cities, and more can make up watersheds. Some cross municipal, provincial, and even international borders. Watersheds come in all shapes and sizes and can vary from millions of acres, like the land that drains into the Great Lakes, to a few acres that drain into a pond. So you can have micro watersheds, which become part of. So my Baxter Creek watershed in Peterborough is part of the Otonabee watershed, which is part of the Lake Ontario watershed, which is part of the Great Lakes watershed, which is part of the Atlantic watershed. So we are all connected in that way. So thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, and Susan makes a very interesting point about how the watersheds can cross, municipal boundaries. In Pickering, we have 2 different watersheds, so it's not like it crosses all of these different boundaries. So great point there. But what I'm going to talk about is the Saving the Duffins Creek Wetlands. So this is a case study. So you can see here, this is kind of part of Duffins Creek. And in the very back here, you might see this blue and orange building. I'm not sure if you can see that, it's way in the back. And that's actually the hotel for the casino that Susan mentioned. So that's this is a distant shot from the case study that we're going to talk about. But these areas, as someone mentioned about, water flows down from the one lake to the next lake. That's the concept of a watershed, right? And so we are dealing with talking about some wetlands that were upstream of this area. But of course, they're going to affect the areas downstream, right? If they were developed. So basically what happened is the city of Pickering wanted to pursue this development with the developer of the casino to build on a provincially significant wetland. So this was aside from the casino. They wanted to build a giant warehouse, and it was on, I believe it was 55 acres of provincially significant wetlands that they wanted to build on. So a lot of us were very, very concerned. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why wetlands are important. Just going to give you some of the environmental science background. I have my bachelor's of science in environmental science, so I'm very interested in all this kind of scientific stuff as well. So I wanted to share with you that wetlands are definitely important. They provide soil stabilization. They provide flood mitigation. So wetlands are very good at acting like sponges. They will take in water and then release it in seasons when there's not enough water to feed streams. So they act like great resources and sponges. So it's very important. They're also vital wildlife habitat. As you can see, you've got a moose walking through this one. So it's always a neat thing to see wildlife. So I think that definitely provides to one of our next points, which is recreational opportunities. So wetlands can provide recreational opportunities for, someone mentioned hiking, maybe canoeing, kayaking, all those sorts of things. The pandemic has really brought out, as someone also mentioned, that it's really nice to be able to go out in nature, and it's I just find it brings me peace and calm, and it's great to be out in nature, just to relax and to, as Susan has said, be in our place, right? So there's also water quality improvement. So it acts as a very good filter. So the water quality can improve because it takes, different nutrients out of the water, all that sort of stuff. So without getting too much into the weeds of it, that's the basic information about why wetlands are important. I mean, there's tons of information about that concept. So if you're ever interested in researching more, feel free to do so. There's a ton of information available online or in books at your local library. I encourage you to do that research as well. Okay, so this is a map that I actually created as part of the actions that we were taking, and we put this up on our wetlands. So as you can see here, we have the proposed warehouse on the left-hand side, and the green areas are all identified as provincially significant wetlands by the Ontario government. So they've done studies and they've said these wetlands are provincially significant wetlands. So you can see most of the area where the warehouse was proposed is all provincially significant wetland. Here's the casino over here. And then you can see this green area here. So they wanted to build on this red area. They were also talking about building here and building here, which was not on the provincial significant wetlands. So we weren't as concerned about those areas. But you can also see the creek here. This is the Duffins Creek that goes down through here. And through lots of studies, we were able to see that, which way does the water flow? Well, the water flows, of course, towards the creek. So everything would be affected in the creek if the area where the proposed warehouse was wanting to be built was built on. So we were quite concerned about that. This is an aerial shot. So you can see this is the wetland. There was a bit of kind of area that was farmed on as well, but it was higher ground, so it didn't have the wetlands on it. And that's where they were farming. But you can see over here, there's the wetlands, and it just goes way, way back, right? It's huge. It's huge, huge area of wetlands. So we were quite concerned about that. So what happened was and you might have heard of this in the news, it's something that's been around for a long time, but we haven't heard much about it, but it's called an MZO, or a Minister's Zoning Order. And what that does is it gives the government of Ontario the ability to override local planning authority. So normally if there's a development, right, that's proposed and it's not zoned for whatever the development wants, the local planning department at your city or town would have to put up signs and say, this area is being proposed to be rezoned, and they would have their staff do studies and they would get public input and all that information. But with an MZO, the provincial government is able to override everything and just say the zoning is now this. So it was quite concerning that they were requesting this MZO to be put on the land. And eventually they did get approved to get an MZO put on the land. But we were not going to stop from making sure that we kept the wetland as is. So I just wanted to mention two here. So I already mentioned that the MZOs have been increasing over time, and between 1995 and 2018, the present government has issued more MZOs than that entire period of time. So they've only been in office for less than 4 years. And between 1995 and 2018, there's been more MZOs than by the present government than during that whole time period. So it's quite concerning to see, and there's a very good website resource I'll provide where you can see all these MZOs, and you might have heard of some of them in the news as well. Now we're just going to show a quick video. So I'm going to stop sharing and reshare my other screen here briefly. Let me just share that. Just to give you kind of a quick idea of the news attention that we got. And if you can just let me know if you can hear this.
I can't hear it.
Can hear it? Okay. Let me just try resharing. I think I'm just have to share the audio. There we go, share sound.
It's a project that is causing concern, putting 55 acres of provincially significant wetlands at stake.
What's going ahead now is completely filling in the wetland that was not part of the original proposal.
The land in question is this swath of wetlands just west of Squires Beach Road, where construction and development could begin after a minister's zoning order was pushed through.
They'll destroy about half of the overall 23 wetland complex that exists there.
This has been rammed through. I mean, how are we supposed to negotiate with a group, Pickering and Durham Live, when they're being told by the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing that this is a done deal?
The order was put in to fast-track 2 developments, a film studio, part of the Durham Live entertainment spot, and a project called Lone Star. Now, with this order, there is no public consultation.
You basically have a complete loss of authority, autonomy, ability for the public to have a say locally.
And we're learning part of that deal pushed through is accommodating some sort of warehouse.
Now, try adding 4 million square feet of commercial warehouse space and 1,650 high-density residential units to that. That's another several thousand vehicles per day on top of that.
Ajax Mayor Sean Collier says they had been taking part in good faith negotiations with all parties involved when suddenly they were cut out.
Not only were we pushed out of the deal, but everything that we've been negotiating for the last 4 months has just gone as well.
The town has always voiced concern about traffic and development impacting the area. Environmental Defense says disrupting the lands could cause problems down the road.
We stopped destroying these wetlands by policy, by law, because we realized that the things that we did, like to the Don River in the 19th century, were a mistake.
The city of Pickering says with the pandemic delaying the opening of the casino, jobs are top of mind, and these projects will provide 3,000 of them.
From our perspective, it's not really a choice between protect the environment and securing much needed investment. I think both can happen.
The province says the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority and the proponent have signed an agreement that would lead to the creation of ecological benefits. But Environmental Defense says it doesn't work.
That would not be possible. This type of wetland cannot be recreated.
Regardless of each party's concerns, the TRCA still has to give permission to the developer before shovels can hit the ground. Fraser Snowden, Global News.
Okay, so yeah, that video was just a quick one, just to show you some information about that wetland. Let me just get back to our slides here. Okay. And so what did we do? Well, we came out in droves and we did all kinds of different creative things. It was during the pandemic, so we had to be very cautious and careful about what we did. But essentially, we had a march. We ended up having protest lines and blockades in front of the area where they were trying to get in to do borehole drilling. And I was reminding Susan yesterday, we were chatting about it and we were laughing because we had these blockades and we were there, I think was it like 6:30 or something in the morning, and there to be there before the workers got there, and we were in our cars and we were freezing and we were cold, and I'll never forget when I saw that truck come and it pulled over and they couldn't get into the spot, and we were so excited, and it was just thrilling to see us be able to stop the development. And the other interesting thing I just want to mention based on the video was that there was actually about 3 other locations nearby where they could have proposed this warehouse, but they chose to propose it on a provincially significant wetland. And the whole thing that happened too was that the Ontario government ended up retroactively putting in a law that said that the TRCA, the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority, had to issue the permit because it was an MZO. So they changed the law retroactively. So we were up against all kinds of stuff. So I really want to give you as this sense of hope, and you can do it in your local community. We were up against all kinds of barriers and all kinds of things, but we knew that we were in the right and we wanted to save this wetland. So I'll let Susan kind of talk a bit about this too, because this was kind of some of the work that St. Martin's and St. George's did at the Wetland March. If you want to have any comments on this, Susan.
Sure. So this is our two groups. We started to meet, and I have to say, some of these people were at many of the different protests and came out for different things. But this really galvanized people's attention, and because of the work that both of these communities had been doing around the environment and getting outside their buildings and getting out onto the land and appreciating what we were entrusted to. So Anglicans Caring for Creation was the little coalition that we formed around this. And I think one of the most important things here was that as churches, we were connecting with others in our community and creating those relationships and kind of, it's always said in the kind of missional literature that churches need to go out of their buildings and see where God is already working and get on board with that. And that's kind of what happened here. We saw that there were really committed people in the community who were way out in front of us on this. And we had these concerns, and it was really important for us to put our energies to supporting that movement and learning from it and connecting with it and participating in it. So that was a really important lesson for us as faith communities. Carry on there, Brendan.
Yeah, and there was just one more picture here.
Yeah, so this was, I remember it well, it was December 5th, it was freezing cold, and we, for our very first thing in Advent, you can see I have my purple chasuble on. I don't know what possessed me to wear my chasuble down there, but I think we wanted to be visible, and that was our decision, that I would wear a chasuble that would make us very visible. So this is right on the wetlands that we're talking about here. And our little group of creation caretakers went down and we celebrated the Eucharist on the land. And then we walked across the land and around and then up and down the road. And we celebrated the Eucharist and prayed for the land. And people made signs, as you can see: save, don't pave, connecting with our watershed, save our land, and so on. And so this was kind of the way we began. And we continued with this tradition in our church of praying on the land. So we will go out for the solstice. For example, we did a nighttime service. We went out on Earth Day and did a compline. We've gone on walks and so on, as a way of continuing to pray with the land and on the land, in order to deepen our connection to it and to kind of express that idea that location is vocation. So there you go.
Great. So what can you do in your local community if you have a concern about something, right? So keep aware of issues in your neighborhood. As Susan's been saying, look at where you have been placed on this earth and look around you and, is there an issue? Bring it up at your church, bring it up with your family, your friends. Start an environmental advocacy group. Share the taking of minutes for local community council meetings. So looking at local council meetings can be a great thing to kind of keep in mind. And they do usually post minutes and sometimes recordings online. So if you want to keep an eye out for that and see what kind of things are happening in your local community, that's a great spot. Don't be afraid to reach out to local city councilors, MPPs, or MPs whenever it's appropriate. So I know it can be a struggle too sometimes to know, like, well, who's responsible for this? Do I reach out to my member of provincial parliament, my member of parliament, my city councilor? So you can always give one of them a call, and they can their office will hopefully redirect you. if you've called like the wrong level of jurisdiction. Get petitions going online. Susan and I were just in a meeting last night for the next advocacy group issue is the Carruthers Creek now. They are talking about building on the Carruthers Creek headwaters. So we've been looking at developing a petition for that. Send press releases to the media. So if you're having like an event, you can send a press release to the media ahead of time so they'll know to come, or you can send them pictures and like a little description of what kind of actions you're doing, and make as much noise as possible, and lawn signs. So we had lawn signs, you might have seen a couple of them throughout the pictures, save the wetlands, that kind of stuff. So if you have these catchphrases that you can have, we had these lawn signs. I know Susan was very helpful in helping distribute those as well throughout the community, and it just helps bring attention to it and get people more involved, and they see that there's a resistance happening, and we can really make sure that we look after our land, right? So that's hugely important to make sure that you know that you can do something about it. You do have a voice, and there is hope. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really important to the petitions and the lawn signs and the blockades and the protests and all of that is just as much about challenging the decisions that are being made by the people with authority and power in these situations as it is about raising awareness and getting, because it was really this action with the Pickering Wetlands really showed me how a groundswell of public opinion can change everything. I'm sure that you all have experience with this, but that was really moving and important to see how the community coming together. The morning of the march, I was telling Brendan, I was absolutely panicked because we thought, oh, if we get 50 people, that will be great. Well, 300 showed up, but it was the middle of the pandemic. And so it was like, stand back, everybody, get apart from one another. And I remember saying to the others, we have to go right now because these people can't be gathered together like this, And so it was against all odds we did this march, but it really was a game changer. We found out that the warehouse occupier was going to be Amazon. And once that public opinion around the public pressure to disallow this MZO and this warehouse, they backed out, and it kind of went like dominoes. Each level kind of said no, they wouldn't do this. And I think it was because people in the community rose up and said, no, we want to preserve this wetland.
Yeah. So eventually what happened too is they revoked part of the MZO. The part that really bothered me is they did a public consultation to remove part of the MZO, but they didn't do public consultation to implement the MZO. So it was really frustrating, but yeah, at the end we were successful and we were able to save this wetland. They've changed the zoning now, so we're very excited and very happy, and hopefully we can keep more of these watersheds protected. Any other closing remarks, Suzanne?
No, I think we should open the floor and give some space for people to talk and ask questions. I'm just going to check what's in the chat here. Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing and great pictures as well. Always appreciate that. I have a bunch of questions that I would like to ask, so I'm going to exercise my power to ask at least one of them. Other folks, if you would like to use the same process, either putting something in the chat that I can share, or by sticking your hand up and I'll call upon you in order. Susan, I'm wondering if you would speak a little bit more about what it was like to be present as a church body within that coalition or within that movement. This is something I find very, very interesting. How you call upon that spiritual power and ways to be present, and how that was received by other groups, or was there any pushback or anything like that?
I experienced incredibly warm welcome when I first attended a meeting. I remember going to my very first ENAP meeting, and I had just phoned up and said, we have this little creation caretakers. We're really worried about this wetland and we're not quite sure what to do, but we see that you're doing some stuff. And she said, great, come to a meeting. And I went to a meeting, and I remember they said, okay, so here we are, we're going to start. So I think we're going to have a blockade. And I went, wow, right away. So for me then, I felt very much that this was, if you will, an answer to a prayer, because I felt very called to be advocating for this land that I'd come to know and love, and was outraged at what was happening. And here were people who were going to show me the way. So for me, it was very much about being connected to these people who had things to teach me. And then my spiritual path became trying to be as helpful as possible. So when people said, oh, we need a way to deal with the money that we're receiving, donations and so on, we need a way, we need a place for signs, we need this sort of thing, that I was able to, the church was able to be supportive of this good work that was happening. And that really was what it was about for me. So I'm not sure that that answers your question, but I think these coalitions, the church has got to get out of its building and get out of these kind of cloistered spaces that we inhabit, and get out into where these really critical issues are being addressed. There's lots going on. So
thank you. That does answer my question. It's really good, and I feel like it really connects with the theme of the conference as well. You know, remembering and understanding that, you know, sacred space doesn't stop at the church door. It's not the way we would want. So I note a question from Lynn. Has anyone from the group tried to stop the 413 highway through King Township? Contacted your group?
Yeah. Brandon, can you speak to the 413?
Yeah, so I know there's a few folks that we have a private Facebook group, and a few folks have posted for ENAP, for Environmental Action Now, Ajax Pickering. A few folks have posted stuff about the 413. We haven't directly been involved in anything there that I'm aware of, because you've got this Carruthers Creek thing coming up. But that's actually a really good point. And I think a great thing about this kind of, you know, outreach too, is that we should be helping out other communities too, because, you know, we've built this strong movement in our community. Well, why don't we share that knowledge and share that strength to other communities as well? So that's actually a really good point, and I will bring that back to Environmental Action Now, Ajax Pickering, and see if we can do anything to help with the 413, because I know that's a huge issue as well. If they're having any kind of march or something, the pandemic restrictions are lifting now, so we could definitely reach out to them.
That's awesome. Yeah. I just want to re-emphasize that. I think you learn a lot by doing this type of work, and you get into the certain habits of presence and of connection with folks. And yeah, you don't want to just leave that in the one situation. You want to be able to share that beyond and bring that energy. I want to ask about, particularly when we're talking about land issues, about Indigenous presence. You know, I personally believe it's really important. I'm a settler, and I think it's really important that I take responsibility for the space that I occupy. And sometimes that means settlers organizing together to protect the land. But there's often a lot of opportunities to connect with Indigenous land defenders as well. And I'm wondering if that was a situation that you dealt with.
Yeah, we had help from, with support from the Indigenous folks, the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. Chief Kelly LaRocca spoke at council meetings, all that sort of stuff. So it was great to have their backing, and see that they also, you know, supported the same things that we were talking about. Not sure if Susan has anything else to add.
Yeah, well, Chief LaRocca also, you're talking about Indigenous bodies and communities, and I think that's a really important, that's an important awareness that we must always, as the church, be mindful that these lands are not ours. Their stewardship belongs primarily to the First Peoples. And I remember the way that Chief LaRocca asserted the Mississaugas of Scugog stewardship of the land, and just insisted on it. And how I think that was a really important part of this, because I think that challenge to the city councilors, especially in Pickering, was really profound and really moved this whole issue. Trying to think if I want to say anything else about that. I think that's all.
Thank you. No, I appreciate you taking that, giving that gracious answer. I think even right at this moment, we're in a moment where the particular spiritual calling of Indigenous nations is being recognized on a larger level in a way that I think it wasn't 10 years ago. And I think that's really, really wonderful. And there's a lot of opportunity for those of us who are settler people to lift up and pass the mic to Indigenous communities who are doing this type of work. So, and yeah, it gets very complicated sometimes when it's questions about land ownership and things like that. So we have to keep all of these things in mind as we do that.
Brandon can tell you more about this, but the Carruthers Creek folks, the advocates for the Carruthers Creek, had a press conference, and actually Chief LaRocca attended that gathering and spoke to that issue. So
yeah, so unfortunately, Chief Kelly LaRocca wasn't able to make it in the end, but some of the council spoke.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, they were hoping that she was able to attend, but she's had so many things going on that she wasn't able to attend that one. But yeah, the council did speak. There's a recording online of that if anyone's interested. It was a press conference done by the official opposition. So Andrea Horvath spoke, a couple MPPs, a regional councillor, someone from our group, ENAP, and then also the folks from Scugog Island First Nation.
I see that you've put up some links to some resources. So perhaps you'd like to just talk us through some of that stuff or kind of what some next steps might be.
So I realized that this doesn't work so well with hot links right embedded in here. That's my mistake. I'm kind of clunky with technology, but the Laurel Dykstra talk is Anglicans talking to each other. And if you just Google Laurel Dykstra Watershed Discipleship, you'll find it. Again, that website for the watersheddiscipleship.org, there's tons of articles on there. It's a very good resource list. That's a really good place to start reading and looking around. Environmental defense is a great place to find out about what's going on here in the province. And Tim Gray is a great resource, he's a leader there. And you can find out about different actions that are going on. And they are also a great source of information. Yours to Protect, and then ENAP, both of those websites there. I also want to mention, there's a lot of people who mentioned here that they had cottages in areas that they were really concerned about in Haliburton and Algonquin and so on. And, you know, the geography of Ontario kind of starts with those St. Lawrence lowlands at the Great Lakes and moves north. You get the limestone steppes, and then you get the granite. And all of that kind of transitional area as you move north, sort of up, if you go up Lake Ridge Road, you can kind of start to see this happen north from the GTA. But all of that area is very rich and diverse ecologically. You get ecotones where the limestone and the granite are kind of interwoven, and you get these very, very diverse intermingling ecosystems, which are called ecotones. And there's a film series called The Land Between, which will help you understand the richness of that whole area. It's available. I know that, I think it was episodic in TVO, but there's also a film. So look up The Land Between, and that will galvanize your desire to advocate for those lands, because it's really, really powerful. I remember when I went to the parish of Fenelon Falls in Cobequid, I noticed that they were completely different. The landscape was different as I drove from one to the other. They were 15 minutes apart. The culture was different. People sounded different. And I suddenly became aware that these are like two different worlds, but they kind of intermingle. And it was all about the geology. One was the kind of silt of the St. Lawrence lowlands, where it was farming communities and sheep pastures and so on. And the other was Cobequid, where it was all limestone. And there were tulip trees in the Alvar regions just around that area, which we'd never find over in Fenelon Falls, just 15 minutes away. So once you start to get an appreciation of that, you start to recognize the kind of intricacy and beauty and richness of God's creation, and how important it is for us to get to know, love, and serve it.
Thank you so much. We are basically at the end of our time.
Okay.
So I would just like, on behalf of the group, to offer our thanks, Susan and Brandon, to you for leading us through this, through sharing your experiences and encouraging us to know and to serve the places that we love as well.